Coming up on UGTV. A special session of the Unified Government of Wyandotte County, Kansas City, Kansas.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to ask the clerk to please announce the meeting and call the roll.
A special session has been held on Thursday, October 29th, 2015, immediately following executive session regarding a compensation study and backfire barbecue. Roll call: McKiernan.
Here.
Mugia.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
Kane.
Here.
Markley.
Here.
Walters.
Here.
Philbrook.
Here.
Bynum.
Here.
Walker.
Here.
Townsend. Holland.
Here. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Bach to give us the timeline, or if he wants to turn it over to his assistant.
Thank you, Mayor. I mean, this really stems from a commission directive where we put on place and funded this during the 2015 planning process. So in 2014, that during this calendar year 15, we would do a compensation study for employees. Joe Connor, assistant in my office, has been on point in this project, so I'll turn it over to Joe and let him introduce our guest and walk through the study.
Sure. Thank you, Doug. Mayor and Commissioners, thank you for the opportunity this evening to talk about our compensation study. With me today is Dr. Jim Fox with Gallagher Benefit Services, formerly known as Fox Lawson, correct? Right. Jim helped us back when we did their original compensation study after unification, so he's very familiar with Wyandotte County and our organization. I just want to talk briefly from a staff perspective where kind of we go from here. There's some next steps in Jim's presentation, but from a staff perspective, we'll be digesting a lot of this information, and you're getting a very high-level overview. There's a much more detailed report that will be made available, and we're still digesting it ourselves, for next steps from a staff perspective. But we certainly want to keep the commission engaged in this process. Ultimately, I believe that we will be coming back during the 2016 budget process with some recommendations for budget on this particular topic. In the interim, we will provide you with additional information as well as we start to go through it. Probably through the standing committee process would be the best, but we'll do whatever you'd like to do on the compensation side. And again, we feel like it's a real important step for our employees. We feel like there's good information here that we can move forward with, and I'm not going to, I did want to make one more introduction. Behind me is Gail Merriweather. Gail is with Gallagher Benefits as well, and Gail is a vice president for the company. She's here in Kansas City. One of the things we structured into this agreement was if we wanted to use Gallagher Benefits for any additional services, we had the opportunity to do that, and that was part of this bid process. And so as we start to identify projects, we'll probably be working through Gail, since she's here local, and continue to work through the particular issues that we may have, details into the report, or other projects that you may identify that you want us to work on. So we have that kind of in place to move this project forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jim and let him go through his presentation.
Thank you. I guess it's good afternoon yet, right? What I want to do is I would just want to go over some highlights of this study so that we can just kind of paint a picture for you, so that when further analysis is done, further recommendations that come before you, you'll have a framework under which to look at this. So we were hired to do a compensation survey and benefits survey. There were a lot of benefits questions as well in the study, and we studied 54 union and non-union, what we call benchmark positions. These are jobs that we think do a good job of representing the different levels and types of jobs within the organization. And so we wanted to get a snapshot of what the market was doing, since most organizations haven't had many pay increases or pay adjustments over the last several years. And so are we still on track? Are we behind? Are we ahead? What's happened? So we looked at those 54. We developed a customized salary survey that we sent out to organizations. I'll show you those organizations. And then we did follow-up emails and phone calls. The HR department, Renee and Shakiva, helped make those calls as well to ask, because they have those connections usually. And so that helped in getting some of those participants back. Now, there are a couple of standards. When we send a questionnaire out, we have a summary of the job. So if it's a public health nurse, for example, we'll have a brief description of what that job is, what the minimum qualifications are, duties and responsibilities, and so on and so forth, things that will identify that job. And we'll ask those participant organizations to match 70% of that to their job, so that we have a good, solid match. And that's a professional standard that our profession has established. And it's usually a pretty good indicator that we have a good match. So we're not matching on job titles, we're not matching on anything else, we're looking at duties and responsibilities. So when we got the data back, occasionally we'll find some outliers. So one organization will say, well, we pay $40,000 and everybody else is paying $30,000. So we'll call them back and say, what's up with this? Why are you, do we have a good match? Is there something unusual about your job that we need to know about? So that we can, at least when we summarize that data, we're confident that it's good information. Now, we collect a lot of information around this area, this geographic area, but there are some organizations that we got data from, Minneapolis, Indianapolis, and so on and so forth, that have a different labor market than you do. So what we did is we took their data and we adjusted their data to the Kansas City, Kansas labor market. Now, this is done by an index. We get this index from a third party. They're located in Seattle, Washington. And it's a combination of a cost of living and the cost of labor. So there's kind of a mixture there. It's not perfect, to be honest with you, but it's the best there is in the industry. But it does allow you to take those different swings that, for example, if we surveyed New York City, we all know that's going to be a little higher than here, I think. So we would adjust that data downward. And so we think this is a pretty good representation of what the market is. So we identified 30 other organizations that we thought were similar in complexity, size, nature, and we sent those surveys out to these organizations. I'll give you a little moment to read through those. Obviously, you'll see a lot of them that are around this area. There's some of them outside the state and outside the region. But we tried to make sure that we got ones that we might lose employees to or gain employees from, as well as those other organizations that are organized in a similar size, similar organization structure, and that sort of thing. So we do have some cities and counties and some other organizations. Now, as it has occurred in the last couple of years, people don't really like to fill these things out because it's a imposition on their time. But we got 14. So out of the 30, we got a little bit less than half. And these are the organizations that sent the survey information back to us. So I think this is a good representation. Now, there are some jobs, there are about 9 or 10 jobs in those 54, where there are jobs in the private sector. So we look to the private sector. Administrative assistant, for example, is one of those jobs. Engineer, another job. And so we look to organizations that survey private organizations to collect market data on those jobs as well. And those are the organizations. Towers, Watson, and Mercer are competitors to ours. They do surveys. They've been doing these surveys for 30, 40 years, probably more actually. And they're a good representation of the private sector. So we added that data in as well, where there were good job matches to the private sector. Now, this chart, there's a lot of numbers here, but what I'd like you to do is focus on the left-hand column. It says organizational information. And I'd like you to go down to the thing that says average, that row. And then the bottom row, which is the unified government. So this is a representation of what those kind of broad characteristics are of those survey organizations. So the average budget for the survey respondents was $446 million. Yours is less, 297, the last number that we had. Your population is 161. The population of the respondents is 389,000. Full-time employees, you're pretty close on the average number of employees, a little bit less. And then the number of job titles, 338, the average is 469. So what I'm showing this for is when you see the data later on, you're a little smaller than the other participants. Now, there's a general trend in the marketplace that normally larger organizations pay a little bit more. So you need to keep that in mind when you look at the comparison numbers or when those numbers become available at a later point in time. These are the 54 jobs that we surveyed. I'll give you a couple of minutes there to look at those as well. You can see that there's a variety of different job types, from different departments, different offices, different functions, different levels. So we got public safety, we have normal government jobs, we have some jobs that are similar in the private sector as well. So this was our representation of the marketplace. Now, I'm about to give you a couple of numbers to demonstrate where you are in the marketplace. But before I do that, in our profession, we like to say, you need to look at this data in a certain way. If you are, so we're going to compare your salaries to the market. And if that difference is within plus or minus 5%, you are highly competitive with the market. If you're plus or minus 10%, and while that's a pretty wide difference, and if I were going to get a 10% decrease or a 10% increase, I'd feel that. But within 10%, plus or minus 10%, you're still competitive. Once you get beyond 10%, you become a little bit misaligned with the market, and perhaps you need to take some action. Now, I'm going to give you aggregate numbers. So of all of those 54 jobs, we average the differences. Some are a little higher than the market, some are paid a little bit lower than the market, but on aggregate, this is where you fall. We looked at actual pay. That's the first set of rows. And if you look at the 50th percentile, that's the number that I'd like you to focus on right now. You're 9.38% below the market. That's on actual salaries. So what you are paying on average to your employees. Now recognize that that 9.38% is within that 10% border. So you're competitive. Now your salary structure, that's which governs how you pay and how you hire and where you top people out. Your midpoint, in other words, kind of the benchmark of where you ought to be paying for a seasoned employees, your midpoint of your salary structure on average across all of those 54 jobs is below the market by 5.14%. So now you're getting very competitive. Now, let me go back to that 5% plus or minus 10%. The reason we say that is if we do this survey in another 6 months, you're going to have some people at turnover. You're going to hire some new people. Those organizations that we got the data from, same thing's going to happen. So that data is going to fluctuate. So if you have this little cushion, you can say, okay, we are either we need to do something because we're over that 10%, or we're in pretty good shape. Now, a couple more details about this chart that I want to show. If you go to the top two rows again, the 25th percentile, so what this says is that you are ahead of the 25th percentile of the market. Now, what does that mean? 75% of the people pay more. 25% pay less. So you're a little bit ahead there. I mean, just a hair. When you get to the 75th percentile, in other words, 25% of the organizations pay more than that, and 75% pay less, you are much lower. You're in the, I'll call it the danger zone for now. Now, what does that mean to me? What that means to me is that you are not moving your people through the ranges at the same rate that the market is moving those people through ranges. In other words, longer tenured, longer seasoned employees in other organizations are moving through the range, are getting paid more than your comparable employees. Now, with regard to the salary structure, the salary ranges themselves, you're a little bit below the market on the minimum. What does that mean? That means that you can probably hire people at a competitive rate. So you're not at a disadvantage generally in hiring people. But your maximums, in other words, where people top out, you're a little bit lower than the market. And that's because your range spreads are a little narrower than what the market is on average. So a couple of things just from those charts. So this kind of repeats that. At the 25th percentile, you're highly competitive. 50th percentile, you're competitive, but you're misaligned at the 75th. Again, people aren't moving through that range in the same fashion that the market is doing. Your salary structure, you're highly competitive at the minimum, competitive at the midpoint, which is kind of where you want people to be after they've been here for like 5 to 7 years in the job. And you're still competitive at the maximum, but you're a little bit lower than others are at the maximum. And again, the market range spread is about 40%. That means from the minimum to the maximum. Your range spreads are 39% on average. So your ranges are a little bit narrower than the market. So there could be an opportunity to expand those ranges, probably at the top end, in order to become more competitive at the market. But it's not something that is so dire at this point in time that you need to take an immediate action with regard to that. So again, hiring rates are reasonably competitive. Now that's not the case for all of the jobs. I mean, there is a good deal of fluctuation in those jobs, in those 54. So it isn't across the board, but there are some jobs that you're paying more competitively than the market. But on average, you're pretty competitive. Now, so kind of the summary just on salaries, you're competitive for both actual pay and salary ranges. Highly competitive with hiring in most cases. Most of the employees are in the first and second quartiles of the salary range. Now what does that mean? First quartile is the lower part of the range. Second quartile is the next one up. And then the third and fourth quartiles go all the way to the maximum. And your salary ranges are a little bit narrower than the marketplace. So kind of a repeat of all that. Now, we also looked at benefits. And we could talk about all of the benefits that we surveyed, but I think the sum total of it is, where are you on all of these benefits? And so I'm just going to try and summarize this as clearly and as simply as possible. So we did a lot of special pay surveys for the fire and police and the sheriff employees. And you're pretty competitive. I mean, maybe you're a little bit lower on one, a little bit higher on another. For example, you might pay $50 where the market pays $75, that sort of thing. So that's reasonably good. With regard to paid leave, which includes personal days, vacations, sick leave, and paid out on leaving, you're ahead of the market. I think you probably knew that. So good, we confirmed that. Wonderful. Unified government leads on health care spend, what you pay for the employee for health care. However, now taking this all into account, you say, okay, we got a bucket of salary money over here and a bucket of benefit money over here. And you're a little bit lower on the salary, but you're a little bit higher on the benefits. You're reasonably competitive on salary, but a little bit lower, but you're a little bit higher on benefits. So if you take all of that and throw it into one pot, together, where are you? You're in pretty good shape. So in other words, if we looked at total employee spend, you'd probably be right in line with the marketplace, because you're paying a little bit more on the benefits, a little bit less on salary. So this is the balancing act that most organizations have to face. Where do we balance? Do we balance it on the hiring rate and the salary, or do we balance it on the benefits? And for most part, governments have provided a lot of benefits. So you are not inconsistent with everybody else. But now it comes to the point, now that you have the data, what do we need to do, or what should we do? And how should we go about that? So, this is kind of a summary, again, just encapsulating all of the points that I've talked about. So rather than repeat those, what I'd like to do is I'd like to get to the point of, well, now what do you do? Okay? There's a couple of things I want to point out. Most organizations, most governments say, well, we need a cost of living increase, or let's adjust our salaries or negotiate our contracts using cost of living. We think that's an inappropriate number. I know it's probably got 75 years of history, but I want to introduce a new idea to you. And that is that you adjust, or you think about how the market moves in terms of the cost of labor. Because that's what you buy. You buy labor. You're not buying housing. Well, most people aren't buying housing. You're not buying bread, although for the jail, I suppose you're buying bread and food and that sort of thing. But your real expense is people. So we ought to look at what's the cost of people. And so what I did is I did a 14-year chart of what has happened with the cost of living versus the cost of labor. So the cost of living is this orange number here. You can see, 2009 it took a dip. We all know what that was. And so we've kind of recovered. Now, if you look at the employment cost index, this is another number that Bureau of Labor Statistics keeps, maintains, and reports on a quarterly basis, which represents the cost of labor. And they do both a cost of salary and a cost of salary and benefits. So you can get a pretty good picture. So let's see if I can, I got a water bottle in the way, that's the problem. So you can see that it doesn't really track exactly the cost of living, but it's reasonably representative. It's a little bit behind the curve, in fact. And so we would suggest that that's the index that you really want to look at. It's about the same amount if you average it over a 10-year period of time in terms of percentage. But it's a number which I think is more honest and more reflective of what you really have to think about. And that, if you do that, you will be in better tune with what the market is doing. Because if you go, well, nobody cut salary. Well, some people did cut salaries in 2009, and they cut out all other things. But you can see what happened. Salaries still increased. And so that was the nasty trick that the press played on us. Everyone says, well, nobody's getting an increase, and I know that you didn't provide many increases during that interim. Well, the market was, There were still people giving people raises. So I've had a lot of clients that have started to do surveys in 2012, and they say, well, nobody's been giving an increase, so we'll probably be fine with the market because we were before the recession. And they find out they're 10, 15, 20% below the market and say, how'd that happen? Well, it happened because other people were giving raises. Okay, so you have more than 54 jobs titles in your organization. We only surveyed 54 as a representative sample of what the market is doing, just to get a sense of what's happening. So even though there may be some differences in one job to another in terms of how you compare to the marketplace, what I'm suggesting is your next step is HR needs to take a look at a couple of things. They need to take a look at the survey data for each one of those jobs. Identify if that is a reflection of the job family. So for example, if we have police officer as one of the job titles, does that reflect the entire scope of police officers, sergeants, and captains, and so on and so forth? And is there a problem in hiring or retaining jobs in that occupation? So we're suggesting that they take a close look, more thorough, more of a deep dive into the data that we've got. Look at turnover rates, look at hiring difficulty, look at other kinds of employment characteristics to identify whether there's any need to adjust any salaries in the future. There's no need to do something right now. The place isn't burning down. So we've got time. Got time to think about it, use a reasoned, judged approach, more analytics, more consideration, more discussion with department heads and so on and so forth, to come to a recommendation that makes good, solid sense, that's affordable, and yet treats the employees fairly in comparison to the marketplace. So this will probably take the next couple of months, I suppose, to look at, but that's what we're suggesting as the next steps.
Commissioner Kane.
Could you go back to where the 50% chart and the 75% chart?
You mean of the comparisons with the other organizations?
Yes.
I can certainly try.
That might have been it.
That might have been it?
That one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been here for 10 years. And if I'm in that 9.38% and then go back to the chart where you showed people were getting raises,
Which,
it's yes,
the line
towards
graph?
towards the
Oh,
end.
yeah, okay. Yes.
That there,
Yep.
it would have been nice to have what our employees haven't got in the last 7 or 8 years, showing that they were down here, and then what's not there either is now we're going to start charging our employees for their insurance.
Right.
And in my mind, 9% is a huge gap. I was kind of hoping this survey would be a little closer than the 9%, because you say, well, that's an okay number. Not if you're in the 9%.
Oh, I
And
understand.
there are some of them, and Hal will talk about this, there are some of them that's got to be a 20% difference.
I was going to ask the question, because unless I got it in an email.
Can you speak directly into the microphone, please?
I'm assuming that no one else has a printed copy of the compensation study yet, the final document. It didn't come by email yesterday, so I could have read it.
No, we don't. We have not. This is the initial presentation.
I'm going to just make the statement, and Mike alluded to it, that you're taking a global view, and I'm curious whether the study will identify particular groupings of employees that you might call clerical or administrative assistants that are significantly, well, let's say more than 10% for the competitive, below market. Many of our administrative assistants, I believe, make competitive salaries. And overall, I suspect that when they're all taken as a unit, you're going to get a number that is statistically or average to look better than it is for a particular group of employees in one particular location. I have an opinion that municipal court and the administrative or clerical of the sheriff's department are significantly below competitive or above competitive, below competitive. Now, will your study identify a problem grouping of employees, a cluster, if you will, of employees where, well, these 20 women, and they are, I think, all women in the sheriff's department, are significantly below, or they're the bottom end that averages the higher end of the administrative. Thank you.
Yeah,
Mayor, I'm not done.
Go ahead.
I'm glad you're here. I don't want you to take this wrong at all, but if I'd like to see the next time we see a graph like this, we add in what our folks weren't getting, for the last 10 years or 8 years, whatever, we only got one raise. And then also in with that monies minus or plus now they're going to have to pay for their insurance, because that's going to make a difference as well. And then that chart might look better to me because, and I said this a couple of times, even though it looks like some people are going to get 1.5% raise, once you throw in that insurance, that eats up some of their 1.5% raise, and in some cases all of it. So these are things that you can't see in the chart, and we've had this conversation since you've been working on that. So in my mind, we need to add to what I'm talking about to that so we can see a comparison with that. Because this is kind of like history. I want to match it with the history and what's actually going to happen when we get done with all these negotiations.
well, I think that would be a good addition to this chart. That really wasn't the initial point of this chart, but it would
I know,
be a
but
nice comparison.
Right, but if you're here and you've been here
Oh, sure.
eight
Yeah,
years
yeah.
and you haven't had a raise, and now
You'd
you're going to
flatten
get
out there at 208,
Right.
or 2008, yeah.
Right, and then now they're going to be tacked on with the insurance, and like I said, that's going to, and then that'll be a better awareness for those of us that haven't been around for 10 years.
Back to Commissioner Walker's comment, the more detailed information will show various jobs and their comparison to the market. And so that's really what I'm asking for in the next steps, is the HR department take a look at whether there are clusters of pay deficiency, I guess is the best way to put that, where there may need to be some activity. Now, the other thing that you need to keep in mind also, and this is the hardest part about pay, is that let's say that the group that you identified is deserving of a raise. Then the question is, well, where are they in the internal hierarchy of other jobs? And if they get a raise, does this ripple through the organization? So we need to take a look at those effects. That is not an excuse to keep pay down. It's just that we need to make sure that we've looked at all of those outcomes when the recommendations are made.
If you have examined our history, and before being on the commission, I worked here for 32 years. We have seldom, if ever, deviated from a universal, everybody gets the same. So the result has been the people at the high end that get 3% actually net more dollars than the 3% at the bottom.
Sure. Yeah.
And of course the disparity is obvious. It keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think where you are in the hierarchy of the organization is somewhat a perspective. If you are in certain positions, you inevitably look to others and say, I'm doing more work than them. And yet that grouping makes more money than I do. I don't know that I've ever seen an elected body decide the hierarchy of who's got the most important jobs, but presumably there are certain jobs at certain levels for certain people or groupings. If you're the secretary to the chief of police, it would be my expectation that you probably, or administrative assistant, you probably make more than other administrative assistants in the organization, at least on the level of how many years of service. I don't want to drag this out tonight because we need to get the report and so forth, but I am convinced that there are clusters of employees that have been as a result of this immutable philosophy we seem to have that, you know, if we only give the people, let's say on the 9th floor, which is our, you know, legal department, administrators, and like, if we only give the people at the top 1%, and we give, you know, some of the people that are now at the bottom 4%, there's going to be this hue and cry. So as long as we keep everything on the table, nobody can complain. 3%, everybody gets the same. No, everybody does not get the same. And the cost of living goes up for everybody. Price eggs to me is the price eggs to you. And I just think there are employees that deserve more of a raise than other employees, not because not based on some kind of subjective merit criteria, but just simply because over the years, their positions have been continually, the disparity continues to grow. And I think that's why we lose people. We invest in people, in training, education, experience, and bam, they're gone at the first opportunity. And we all know of those. We've all heard where we have people who leave because they can move to Johnson County or Kansas City, Missouri and make 10% or 20% more. And we've given them a year of training and or 2 years of training, and we've lost that investment, and we don't ever calculate that in the equation. So that's what I'll say about that.
Sir, did you have any more slides?
No, that's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I also want to differentiate, and I know McKiernan and Walters put their hand up as well. I do want to note that one of the things I want to differentiate between is a COLA, which is a cost of living increase, which I believe should be administered equally. But a COLA is not a raise. It's a cost of living increase. It means a cost of living adjustment. Now, COLAs only ever go up. If the cost of living goes down in 2009, we didn't COLA everybody down, right? But a COLA is a cost of living adjustment. There are two other issues. One is merit-based pay increases, which this organization has not done for a number of years. I think 07 or 08 is when they stopped. But some organizations will give a 1% cost of living increase to everybody, and additional increases would be merit-based. That's another alternative. The third area, though, is just a straight pay adjustment. I mean, we had, in our juvenile justice issue, we had a bunch of people quit. We went to hire new people, and we even had to go to another county to hire temps from their organization, and we were just flat out of market by $2 or $3 an hour, and we just couldn't hire anybody for the job because no one who knew anyone who knew better wouldn't take it. So we had to do a pay adjustment to that role in order to hire. So some of this, I mean, I think the cost of living increase is something we need to struggle with all the time. We do need to continue the discussion of whether or not we want to go back to merit-based increases for pay that department heads would give out. The other piece is there may be some areas, and this is where Hal, I think to your point, Commissioner Walker, to your point, we need to see if there are groups of people who just need a pay adjustment because they're out of market so far that we can't attract and retain them. And we know that that's true in some of our fields. And so we need to look at those groupings. But I just want to sort through the layers because I know there are some areas that we can't hire people because our pay is not adequate. And we have openings that we can't hire. And then the market has gone up. And so if you bring them in at market, they're paid more than the people that have been there 5 years. And that is bad for morale. So you would make a market adjustment into something and it steps everybody to a different place. So I think as we dig into this, the cost of living increase, the COLAs, we're in discussions with and have committed to 5% over the next 2 years for all of our employees. We have made a decision not to do merit-based thus far. But we're going to need this study to show us what clusters of people need a pay adjustment, and we're going to have to deal with that outside of the COLA. I think those are two separate discussions. McKiernan and then Walters.
Thank you. I'm trying to learn a little bit here about the employment cost index, and I'm curious to get a little bit more information or learn a little bit more about why use that index rather than the cost of living. So why use the cost of labor rather than the cost of living, when there are those in the United States who would argue that a greater and greater percentage of workers are not earning a living wage, that in fact there is a divergence between what it costs to live and what people are being paid. And so I'm wondering how using ECI versus CPI takes that into account, if I'm drawing a connection where it shouldn't be drawn, or how we would address those people who say that there is a growing gap between what it costs to live and what people are earning.
Well, all of this chart represents is what the increase is over the prior year. So the living wage is not an issue that is, I mean, it's an issue. I don't want to diminish that, but it has nothing to do with this chart, nor does this chart take into account any of those components. You know, whether you start at $30,000, $10,000 a year, or $150,000 a year, this simply represents what's the market doing in terms of adjusting salaries. And the reason the employment cost index, in my opinion, is a better index to look at rather than the CPI is because you buy people. I mean, it's kind of a crude way of saying things, but you go out, you recruit, you hire talent. The cost of living is a conglomeration of real estate taxes, gasoline, food, lodging, and all of the other things that it takes to live, I guess.
But
Now, they're
all of which
connected.
are paid
They
by
are
the
connected.
people we hire.
Pardon me?
All of which are paid by the people we hire.
True, true. But there is the economic theory that when price of something goes up, people will substitute for a lesser cost item. So you can't say, well, I've always got to eat the same bread. You know, if that loaf of bread goes up to $5 from $1.50, you might find an alternative. You might make it at home for 50 cents. The employment cost index doesn't say, well, we could hire a cheaper person to do the same thing.
Okay.
Now, that may be a management decision, but that doesn't say that.
Commissioner Walters.
I have a couple reactions, and I hope you can take this into account in our future presentations, maybe. One, I think I see very detailed information down to the 100% on salary.
Right.
But then there were some generalities that you presented,
Right.
like all these numbers are higher because they came from benchmark cities that are a lot larger than ours. So I think you owe us some sort of appreciation of what that number is, or give us benchmark cities that apply to Kansas City that we don't have to do some general interpretation of. I think you need to give us a little help on that. And similarly, I think I heard that in general we have higher benefits across the board. It would be nice if we're doing a compensation study to have a combined analysis of salary and benefits rather than focusing so much just on salary. If we do truly want to compare ourselves to other sources of labor, and I do like the employment cost index, and we do compete for talent, and that's why I'm really less interested in what someone makes in Minneapolis and more interested in what they make in some of your other cities, Overland Park, Olathe, Kansas City, Missouri. Those supposedly would be the places we would compete for most of the talent that we need to attract. So it'd be very interesting to know how we compare to those particular cities rather than a conglomerated benchmark.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Commissioner Markley.
So I'm very excited to finally have had this study. And actually the results are sort of what I expected in most respects, which is unusual for those of you who have a lot of studies done. Sometimes you're really surprised, and this time I wasn't necessarily. One thing I was a little surprised about, and I'm sort of extrapolating from that, we obviously have a retention problem, and I think that's where we're seeing that I don't know how you phrased it, but that high point number that was the negative 18%.
Right.
I think we have difficulty retaining employees maybe in a greater way than we had initially considered, and that wasn't something I expected to get out of this study, but I think it's important for us to note that we're having trouble retaining talent. I also think some of us have witnessed over the years that we've been here that we sometimes have trouble promoting talented people because there are less talented people who have been here longer that we put in line ahead of them. Sometimes it happens that we want people to pay their dues, and during the time when we're waiting for them to pay their dues and these less talented people are above them, they leave and find someone who's willing to promote them because they are more talented. So I think we need to make sure that we don't have a philosophy of you only get promoted after you've been here 30 years, and that we do have a philosophy of the most talented person gets promoted when when the opportunity arises. Because those people that are highly talented, they aren't going to wait 30 years to get promoted when they can go into the private sector and be promoted after 5 years because they're highly talented, and that's part of our loss.
Commissioner Murguia.
So I just piggyback on what Commissioner Markley said, that what I heard you say also is that our salaries are competitive and our benefits are highly competitive. So if I got nothing else from this presentation than those two things, that's some great information for me to have. I am interested in what Commissioner Walker talked about in the grouping that you did of 54. I want to know within those 24, were there any glaring discrepancies? So at some point, not now. Well, or if there is something interesting, I'd be glad to listen to that now.
I think this, yeah, I could share that. I don't think this is the forum for that. There are some that are substantially over and substantially under. So that's why I suggest that, and to Commissioner Walker's point, I think you need to take those clusters. I think HR needs to look at those clusters and say, yeah, here's a cluster. We've surveyed a couple of jobs in this job grouping, of similar types of jobs. They seem to be under or they seem to be over. Then the next question is, well, if they're under, do we have, to Commissioner Markley's point, do we have more turnover in that group than in other groups? I mean, is that a significant? Have we had trouble hiring people, qualified people? Mm-hmm. And so there's a number of other issues that HR ought to look at, because it's not just, oh, we're low on salary, let's just raise salary. I think that's the knee-jerk reaction. It's always going to hurt you later on. So I think you need to take a more a more reasoned approach to the.
Right. So I agree with you. Those issues that you just all talked about, and Commissioner Markley, I'm very interested in getting into the weeds on those and learning what the details are. And maybe my next question, the answer will come out to this. If we are competitive in salaries and highly competitive in benefits, I would have to ask the question, why are we having a hard time hiring? And why is it we're having a hard time retaining? What's going on? And I know that's not your piece of it, but now that we've uncovered this, and we know for a fact what's happening, it obviously isn't benefits and pay that's driving our employee base.
Right.
But the issue is, I think we need to look at, I don't think he gave us a full report on how our retention and hiring is going. We have some departments where we have long tenure and people seem to be happy over the long term. There are some that we have a high level of turnover. And I'll tell you one, I did all of my department visits, and I visited the health department, and the number of, you go to some departments, say, what's the average, I ask people who've been here 5, 10, 15, 20 years by show of hands. The health department, I would say, this is non-scientific, 70% of the people had been there 3 years or less. And so there was a lot of turnover in that department. I think we have to look at department by department. It might be that our higher end scale is out of whack in terms of our pay. That doesn't mean we don't have retention. Right? That doesn't mean we have turnover. It just means that the pay is not there. So I think we need to get into what departments we do have trouble, because there are some departments, we have a class for our firefighters, we have 400 people apply. Right? We're not having trouble hiring. We got qualified people coming out of the woodwork. So we need to find out what departments we're having trouble hiring in, and which ones we're having trouble retaining, and which ones are completely out of whack. rather than saying we have a retention problem in the UG. I'm not, having watched our award ceremony of people who've been here 5, 10, 15, 20 years, I think we've got pretty good retention in some departments. I don't know, but I think we've got to dig into that. Commissioner Johnson?
Thank you, Mayor. Just two quick questions. One, and I think this ties into the overall discussion about salaries and compensation in Wyandotte County relative to other localities that are right around us. So my question is, can or should we include the attrition rate by year in the study as we're talking about that, if in fact we're going to include how we compare with those municipalities that are immediately around us? And then, not to jump too far down the road, but just for me to help compartmentalize, how long do you think this process is going to take? Because the concern that I have is if this lingers on, you know, the comparative data that we're using, I mean, I want to make sure that it stays the same as we're going along. And I just don't want this just to
I
linger
can't
on.
answer for HR or the administration. I can tell you that if you don't do something within a year, the data will be stale. So that would be my window.
My hope is we have this study now. We're going to be unpacking it for the next several months and getting into the weeds in terms of what departments need adjustment and what don't. And I think the administrator is going to need to come back in the next budget and say, we need to do some salary adjustments in these departments and recommend what those are. Now, the challenge is, this is always the case, isn't it? The one that's 20% too high, we don't tend to cut 20%, right? But the ones that are 20% too low, we're going to want to bring up. So we're going to need to look at, and the administrator is going to need to look at department by department, how the comparatives go, and bring us a recommendation for budget implications. And what's that number? Is that does $500,000 adjust everything we need to do for all of our salaries to get everybody who's not competitive? Or is this a $5 million line item? I mean, that's a different discussion, isn't it? If it's a $50,000 line item, then we all say aye and we'd be done. But I think we need to get from the administrator, and then the administrator's going to have to prioritize those and say, these are our urgent needs. We need to fix these first. And the other thing I don't want to do, I think the last time we did a comprehensive compensation study organization-wide was at unification. You know, I think we need to be doing this in the 5 to 8 year range. I don't know what your recommendation is. You want us to do it every year because we pay you to do it. But what's the industry standard in terms of how often people do these?
Well, it varies a little bit by the level of inflation. Go back to a term I don't like, but it's readily available. You know, we're perking along at about 2.5 to 3% salary increases, at least in the general market. So I'd suggest every 3 to 5 years. You know, 4 years is a good time. That's a good thing to do a survey like this. If you ask me in 2009, I'd say you could probably extend it out a little longer. But I think if you go out much longer than that, then there are all sorts of bumps that happen in the labor market, and you just want to make sure that you've captured them. So, for example, if we did this in 1999, we'd say, you know, the IT people need a big increase because the COBOL legacy systems are going away, and they're just a handful of them left. So we've got to give them a big increase. If we did the same survey of IT professionals in 2006 or 2007, not much of an increase.
I guess I just wanted to mention too, and Jim talked about it, but there's a challenge with getting these surveys turned back in. And I can't stress enough the amount of time that Renee and Shakiva spent helping Jim, you know, pleading with people, please get this survey turned back in. So that's a big part of this work, and you know, I think, you know, Jim said 14 out of 30 and he's happy. Of course he'd be happy with 20 out of 30, but we got 14 and that's good. But so doing them, you know, often enough, the surveys are tough to get, and we spend a lot of time helping with that particular part of it. So I just wanted to mention that for the commission, that we may, you know, everybody gets a survey, not everybody wants to fill them out. So that's a challenge.
All right. Well, I appreciate the executive summary we received tonight. We will we'll look to the administrator to bring this back to us in terms of next steps.
Yeah, and I think as they've laid out tonight, what we'll be moving through is HR will lay out the process with Mr. Connor, along with what we're going to do to go through and do our analysis of the clusters or groupings of employees where we did see more disparity. And pair that along with areas, because this really just, I guess in my opinion, and it always offered from that perspective, it offers where we are in comparison to other agencies, and that's interesting information. But the bottom line for me, and it's one you guys spoke to, is what's my attraction and retention issues? And if I have a particular trouble attracting in a certain area, I have to raise the pay to get people into it. And if we have a very high turnover in a given area, that's a higher area we want to put emphasis on, because I don't like to continually train people all the time to a given area. So I think those will be the areas of focus, coupled with this information that we'll come back to the commission with and explain, here's what we're looking at for a strategy in those areas. And then on the few areas where we do have a higher issue, you know, sometimes the market can just catch up with that, but we can look at those and see whether we want to develop a strategy in those areas or not. Fortunately, there's not too many of them that fall into that category.
All right, thank you, sir. We appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
All right, we have our next item. There had been a request for a discussion about the follow-up discussion on the backfire barbecue. And so I'm going to turn this over to the administrator to walk us through.
All right. Thank you. I do. How are you doing? Okay, this issue is on related to the Village West Star Bonds and Backfire Barbecue. Questions have been asked about what happened in relation to the foreclosure activities at this restaurant, what happened in the selling of the property. So I wanted to step through this tonight. And one, it's kind of a start, and that's where I started up here with kind of a bigger overview of the Star Bonds and where they all come from. But the Backfire Barbecue restaurant was one that we initially started with Steve Schussler. He's the creator of T-Rex restaurants and also Rainforest, both very successful venues. The T-Rex restaurant obviously in the Legends area, and that's one that we've been very successful in having that in our community for a number of years. This concept came forward for the Backfire Barbecue with Red Development, who was running the center, as well as Steve Schussler. New concept with Orange County Choppers. Unfortunately, as we're aware, it wasn't as successful as his other venues that he brought forward. The overview that I put up here really just talks about where we're at in overall investment. We've had about $2 billion worth of investment done in the Village West area. So $1.5 million in private investment, $453 million in Star Bond investment. Yeah, so about $2 billion total, just a little under that.
That 453 should be billion in Star Bonds?
No, million. All the Star Bonds will be paid off 2017, 4 years ahead of the original schedule. Retail sales generated in the area is about $650 million a year, and another $58 million in sales and guest taxes that are coming out of that area. So in perspective, this is a $3 million invested in Backfire Barbecue. That says less than 1%. It was actually about 2/3 of 1% of the total Star Bond investment was part of this particular investment that we ventured into. And so it wasn't successful. We've had 115 successful businesses in that area. The Star Bond incentive that we used with Backfire Barbecue was similar to what we used with, well, it was the same type that we used when we did the Cabela's development, when there were mule deer purchased in that aquarium, also in the T-Rex restaurant where there's the dinosaurs and such that we purchased, took ownership as they went through it. So there was the personal property side of that equation of how that worked. the taxpayers of our community didn't have any liability with anything that was purchased within Backfire Barbecue. It was all purchased with the Star bonds, so it was all part of various investments that were made in that area. And maybe just to step back and look at the timeline of events so you get an understanding of where the money was invested that went into Backfire Barbecue. And in May 26 of 2004, our commission approved an amendment to our mastered agreement with Red Development that set aside $13.5 million in Star bonds for the purchase of personal property as part of their $250 million project. And that's a real important note. So the questions will come, and I know we had several interviews and we went through and talked to the press and got back in different issues when questions came out about this initially. There was a $250 million project that was set out. This was part of the greater project to which $13.5 million was set aside within Red's budget to say, okay, that can go for personal property. And they had to come back to us and say how specifically they wanted to expend that money. But we authorized that back early on in the project to say here was money that was going to go as part of the overall incentive to make the Legends development the successful development that it is today. In 2009, Commission adopted a resolution to execution a management agreement with Creative Attractions, and that's Steve Schussler's firm, and the Legends LLC, the firm that's running the overall Legends Center. It authorized execution for the agreement between the UG and Red to use $3 million of that $13.5 million for personal property for Creative Attraction amenities in relation to the Backfire Barbecue project. It was identified in that agreement just what these amenities could go forward. I mean, there was a line item, and I'll say it had ability to move money within it, but it generally laid out about $2 million that would go toward items such as the motorcycles, different amenities in the store, and then about $1 million that went toward more of the furnishings, kitchen operations, things like that, some of the clerk things that are items for reservations when they come in, part of the sound system and things that were throughout the center. So that was really generally how that was laid out within the development agreement that the commission approved in 2009. As we move forward then 2013, this is the time when Backfire closed up their business. When they moved out of that area, we had a provision within our development agreement that said we could notice them up. We did that administratively to call them out. They advised that they are in default of our agreement because they were supposed to be there and operate for a number of years. So it's important to note, had they stayed in and operating like Cabela's, like T-Rex, beyond the point of when Star Bonds paid off, then they took ownership of all those items. They would fall over onto their side of the ledger, which occurred not too long after 2013 because there's actually, as you all know, there's a couple different tranches of bonds. The bonds that were used for this area in the main part of Village West have been paid off now for a couple of years. Well, about the end of around 14 when that paid off, and then the rest of them we're paying off now are what's related more to the soccer project. So we gave them the notice. We left everything on site. We worked with Red out there. It was kind of like, what are we going to do with this? We had tried to work with Creative Attractions if they would buy some of this, if they were looking for future restaurants, because we realized that'd probably be the highest and best value to do anything with those items. We began moving the property in March 31st of 14, as we realized nothing was going to happen there. We needed to get it off property and get it into secured area. January 15, we determined that we were going to move forward. We needed to auction off the items, so we put out a notice for auctioneering services. We executed a contract with Higginbotham Auctioneers to come in April, and then we had our auction in June. And I will go back to those items here as we move forward. I think some of the questions we've had asked, and I have a couple of guests here at the table with me that I've brought up. Kirk Sherman, who's with Newmark Grubb Zimmer, who was Zimmer Management Company at the time. They were hired as our master developer. And not only as a master developer did they help us work in the attraction of new developments, but they were also the professional firm we hired to bring in and oversee and look at different purchases that were made, everything that was purchased with star bonds. So their verification. And then Marty Higginbotham, who's with the auctioneering company that we hired to go out in the auction process, and I will have him talk a little bit about that. So first I'd like to go back and have Kurt Sherman with Zimmer to go through and talk about your process, Kirk, as you went through and whenever we would buy items, and you can kind of hit that from a general, but then if you do specifically when you looked at the purchases we made in relation to this, and if you'd grab one of those microphones. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Doug. As a project consultant, one of the tasks we had was once we got the venture agreement, and Doug talked about what was spelled out about the star bonds and the specific items that were approved within that star bond process. For Backfire Barbecue, there were $3 million, and within that $3 million, there was probably 40 or 50 line items that said motorcycles, X amount of dollars, memorabilia, X amount of dollars. And so one of the tasks that we had in our scope of work was to verify the payment application process. So when the payment application process was submitted, they would submit a draw to us, and we were to review that draw and make sure that the documentation that was associated with that draw matched up and was star bond eligible. So we would take a look at the backup, all the invoices, made sure the invoice matched the payment application, and made sure those invoices that were the backup for that matched the star bond eligibility and those line items. So that process was used. I think there were 3 payment applications within Backfire Barbecue, so that was done 3 times. And at the end, they totaled the $3 million. Those were then submitted to the unified government, that we verified the invoices, verified that the invoices supported the backup in each one of those line items, and that totaled $3 million, and that's the process that we use to verify those payment application processes.
Thank you, Kurt. Then fast forwarding, many years after that, when we foreclosed on this property, after they had been in operation for 3.5 years, I think it's important to note that Backfire Barbecue, based on the size of restaurant and approximately where they would be, probably generated about $500,000 in sales taxes that paid back into the project as their contribution as a general number for something like, for a restaurant like that, is what they would have contributed back toward payments. We took the property and proceeded to the auctioneer. So we went out for requests for proposals, received a few proposals that came in, and evaluated those for their capabilities, and we ultimately selected Higginbotham Auctioneers. And I guess, Marty, I'd ask if you would talk a little bit about your company, and then if you would discuss the process you used in going through to get this process ready for auction, and the auction, and how things resulted.
Thank you,
with this
Doug.
process.
You certainly will. Well, first off, Marty Higginbotham, Higginbotham Auctioneers International. This is my 56th year as an auctioneer, and I know I don't look that old, and I appreciate that. But the bottom line is I've been doing it a long time. So we've had the opportunity of selling everything from cemetery lots to shopping centers, and we've sold for the U.S. home to the U.S. government. So we've had a broad range of experience in the auction industry. We sell a lot of collections over the years. In fact, the matter is our next collection starts tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. We'll be down in Overbrook selling motorcycles and 50 antique automobiles and et cetera for an estate. And if you've been watching TV, you've been seeing those ads. Hopefully you've been seeing those ads. But in any case, that's our next sale. But that's what we've been doing. And I could give you a lot of time, energy, and effort on that, but I don't think that's necessary at this point unless you have a particular question. But as far as Backfire is concerned, we looked at it, we evaluated it, we set up an advertising promotion program, and did what we ordinarily do. We spent about 6 weeks getting the sale ready, and then we conducted the auction. The auction was well attended. We had buyers from 28 states. We sold it online and live, so we didn't miss anybody. We had a number of people obviously there. So that's what we are, and that's in a nutshell. Now we can dig down deeper if you want.
And I'll open this up for commissioners to ask questions if you have anything of Mr. Sherman or Mr. Higginbotham. But I also note that as we went out and sold and ultimately brought in about $150,000, I think there was a UG share that came for the auction. There were also a lot of the kitchen items and speaker items that we looked at, and typically when you buy those items and you go back in to sell them, they're worth about 10 cents on the dollar. And I think we got an appraisal report as his firm went through and looked at them. Many of those items we looked at that we could use within the unified government. So arguably, I mean, we retained something that could have generated $40,000 to $80,000. If you're looking at a value where it could be, we have a sound system over Memorial Hall that we retained back that you were using as backup, and then we'll put it in play. But the dollars spent on those items were about $800,000 to start with. And that's items that we've retained in the possession of the unified government. So there's just different things to consider as we look at that. So, I mean, we look at how much we've held on to and how much they generated in sales. Overall, I could say, overall, this was one project, I guess, that I look at in all of Village West that failed. And $2 billion worth of investment that's been created. And we took a lot of chances. This governing body took a lot of things that went through and authorized and said, we believe we can make that work. And they've all been successful, and we're all looking at how, you know, we bring in $11 to $12 million in property tax from that area. Now we'll be bringing in $12 million in new sales tax beginning in 17 that comes in after the bond sale. So no, we weren't 100% successful in everything that happened out there, but we've been pretty good. And I believe as we foreclosed, we had provisions in place so that Red and Schussler Creative took a loss on this. It wasn't their goal to come out here and set up a shop and then get cleaned out and had everything that they had purchased. Red had to dedicate money that was part of the incentive we gave them to build their shopping center to make this work. They put it into this deal. They didn't get a portion of that $3 million, even though it went down to $150,000 to $200,000. We took it all. So they lost all their interest in this and all the money they put into anything with Schussler Creative. And however, and I don't know all the details between Schussler Creative and Red as to who invested which dollars and the private dollars that went into that, but it all had to be done. And they lost money on that side of it too. So this was not a successful development. And do I wish we could have got more out of the auction process? Yes, I do. I've had a few conversations, you know, with them firm about this, but in the end, that was the value. So I guess with that, I'll open it up for questions and work from there.
Commissioner Walters.
Thank you. I got a couple of questions. First for Mr. Shermer. I think I'm here, and maybe we're all here just to see if there's any possible lessons learned that we can apply to future projects. When I was listening to your presentation, as I understand it, your role was you received a schedule of values or a list of prices to totaling that $3 million, and you verified receipt and issued payment. Was it part of your responsibility, or do you know if it was part of anyone's responsibility to verify the legitimacy of those values that were on that list?
It was not part of our scope of work, and I couldn't tell you other parties within that if it was theirs or not. Mm-hmm. We were not hired to, we did not, in our scope of work, have an expert to tell us what memorabilia is worth. Just as the mule deer, we didn't hire an expert in mule deer to do that. We were there to verify that the schedule of values that was part of the venture agreement was adhered to, and that the payment application process and the invoices verified that application.
Yeah, that's what I heard you say, and I appreciate that. So again, we're looking for possible ways to improve our process. So that was the basis of that question. And you know, there's been, you know, some questions raised about whether we overpaid for some of that stuff, and that's why I'm asking that. I have a question for Mr. Higginbotham. You're the expert on auctions, certainly not me, but a lot of people I encountered afterwards said, man, I wish I'd known about that auction. I would have loved to have been there. And I was at the auction. I heard about it by word of mouth from a friend of mine. I didn't, I read the newspapers, and I'm actually a UG employee, but I didn't know anything about the auction and wouldn't have known if I hadn't just accidentally learned about it from a friend of mine. So is that something that when you talk to clients, you give them options on how much advertising is done, or work together to figure out what advertising and publicity approach makes most sense for that particular auction, or how do you approach that?
Well, first off, we determine who we think the buyer list is going to be. That's the first thing we do. We try to identify the buyers. In this particular case, it appeared that the high-end items was the motorcycles. So we identified motorcycle dealers and clients, people that deal with motorcycles, as being one of the people that we would send brochures to. So we sent out notices to all the Harley-Davidson dealers, as an example, some 4,500 of them. To bring in motorcycle buyers. It's been my experience over the years that people who are involved with the products that we're selling is the ones that's going to come and buy. And that's particularly the case in this motorcycle deal. As far as the equipment is concerned and the restaurant's concerned, we did the same thing. We sent out notices to the restaurant owners in the area. And then Doug and I talked about it before the sale, and they determined that the government could use those items based on what I anticipated and expected them to bring. And I think that was a wise decision, to tell you the truth, because restaurant equipment doesn't bring anything, and from an auction standpoint, or from any used restaurant equipment, just doesn't bring anything because there's so much of it on the market. So consequently, Doug indicated that the government could use it, and if you could, then that's where it should have stayed. And they did not. We did not sell any of the restaurant equipment to speak of, or the rather significant PA systems that was involved, the speaker systems, and they were very expensive and when they were purchased. But again, they're used, so they didn't have much value. But as far as what the sale did, I think the sale was a huge success. As far as what it brought every nickel it was worth, and we had the buyers there. We had the buyers there and online. And when we had 28 people or 28 states represented as buyers, I think you've seen the value. That's what it amounts to.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Commissioner, are you, Mr. Walker?
I'm done.
Okay, Mr. Kane.
Well, first of all, I had actually asked Doug when I heard about the auction. I said, Doug, please tell me when the auction is, and there was some sort of miscommunication because I never heard about it. And like Jim, I had heard about when it was, they're having the auction. By then it was after the fact. And in my mind, if this stuff is purchased by this community, then this community needs to know about the auction. And there was a whole bunch of people that didn't. And in my mind, and I don't know anything about motorcycles, but I was told that those were worth a lot more than what they went for. And there are people from here, from Wyandotte County, believe it or not, that have money. I think some people think that there's not. And there's a boatload that do. So my comment is we failed miserably in my mind. And the second thing is the next time, if this happens again, when we bring a vendor in, we need to know that the vendor is selling the product or has a performance in the past, that this has worked somewhere else prior to it coming here. And I was on the commission when we approved this, but and I was in that building a couple of times, but it never looked like it was going to make it from the jump. So those are some of the concerns I have.
Commissioner Murguia.
So who determined the value of the memorabilia originally?
Kirk, I think this would be one where when the buyer bought it initially and they or Schussler Creative, and then they submitted the invoice. So the owner of the items that was purchased, I assume, would have been who determined the value.
Commissioner, are you talking about within the venture agreement?
So I don't want to get into that level of detail. This deal is very detailed in the terminology used. So I'll just use one example. Somebody bought a motorcycle. So we're just using that as an example.
Through the star bond process or through the
Yes.
auction process?
Through the star bond
Okay.
process, the original acquisition of a
You're-
motorcycle.
You're asking who established the value of $3 million worth of stuff,
Memorabilia, that's right.
whatever it was.
Yes.
Doug would have to answer that.
Okay, the original was, we set out a couple $1 million worth that went into memorabilia and about $1 million toward outfitting toward the Orange County Choppers concept. So they went through and had a listing of different areas that they anticipated the price to be. Those weren't all specific to say it had to be matching. They had to produce invoices for actually what they would then go and purchase later.
Who's they?
Schussler Creative.
So Schussler Creative gave you a list of things they wanted to buy to decorate their store with.
Correct.
Okay, and they had to give you a receipt for that. Did that receipt come from the original vendor that they purchased the motorcycles from?
Yes.
I'm just using motorcycles
Yes.
for as an example.
Same, through all the star bond process, for all the personal property, when they submitted their payment applications, they put behind that an invoice that they paid for, say, someone that made the motorcycle. I mean, if these were custom built, then whoever custom built that motorcycle, they paid, they being Schussler, paid that subcontractor or that contractor that invoice, and then that invoice was attached to their payment application for reimbursements.
Was everything that they bought custom?
I couldn't tell you that.
Because, for example, if I wanted to go buy a Harley Davidson, I'd go to the Harley Davidson
Yeah.
store and I would buy one, and then we would have something to compare what I paid for that Harley Davidson. versus the other
These
one.
were more of the Orange County chopper type things that you see, especially to the Backfire Barbecue, I believe.
Yeah, so I used to watch Orange County Chopper when I was on television, so I know what you're talking
You know
about.
what I mean?
So
Yeah.
I'm just interested. That's how I wanted to know, is there a benchmark for establishing the value originally? Was there a benchmark?
Yeah, I couldn't tell you that. We were not tasked with, there was one, I remember one item was Dale Earnhardt's fire suit that he wears when he drove.
Right.
And that was one of the things that was out there. And to try to put a value on that, they paid $5,000. Whether that was $2,500 or $10,000, we were not there to verify
The
that.
original pricing, actually, that would have been a different partner within Zimmer Management Company that worked on that side of the equation. When we were working with Red and Schussler Creative on the original deal, we went through and they came in with a listing of different items that they would like to put in the store and had a range of values. Now, they didn't necessarily purchase each exact item that they thought they would before we started. It was like, we believe this, here's some items they had a pretty good thing. They'd gone out, I'll take their sound system, I think it's in there to the dollar, because they said, this is the sound system we want, we priced it, we think this all works through the system. But others were items that they may or may not have ended up purchasing, but they would have brought in something similar to that type of motorcycle and had a price that was within their $3 million budget.
Understood. So this is my only concern, and as Jim said, a lesson to be learned, I would think. When you're doing a specialty item or a custom item, and you don't have something to compare it to, that's difficult to place a value on. But then I think what we need to look at is the value for us to turn around and sell. I guess if you're going to buy an antique car, I don't know how the antique car would depreciate in value. I mean, it was old when we bought it. So how does it get less expensive? So that's what I don't understand. So, and if we were willing to pay that much money for that car, so I'm going to make up a number because I don't know what the number was. Let's say we paid $500,000 for an antique car. And if we were willing to pay that amount of money to put it in a store, then why isn't there anybody else out there that's willing to pay $500,000? And if there isn't, then I'm concerned about what we're willing to pay.
I think one of the things too that I think in terms of how we're addressing this, I was here also when we voted on this. Commissioner McGee and Commissioner Kane and I all three voted to support this project. The key to this was they came in when they did the T-Rex, which was before my time, and they said we're going to create an attraction that's going to attract people to the Legends, and that we're going to be able to not only attract their business in the restaurant, but also they're going to come shop here. So we want an attraction. Now, how much does a mechanical dinosaur cost? I don't know. I don't know how you get a comparable, but we gave a budget and said we can, and out of the 13 million, 13.5 that was approved long before we came, they went out and applied some of that to the mechanical dinosaurs, which has done as advertised. Not only people spend money there for, I believe it's a $9 hamburger, and it is the most delicious $9 hamburger I have personally ever eaten. So everyone should go out and eat one with their children. But they came in with a pro forma and said, we're not only going to bring people here, but they're going to bring their kids out to shop. And so it's an attraction restaurant. Same thing with Cabela's. I mean, I don't know how much a mule deer costs, but there's a bunch of them in that thing. I'm sure we paid more than $100 for it, right? But we have this market. But the idea was having a mule deer museum is going to bring more people into the store, and they're going to spend more money. Same thing with the aquarium. It's going to bring more people. It's an attraction. So the 13.5 was set aside for personal property to create attractions, regional attractions that are going to draw people, because there's a lot of barbecue restaurants in Kansas City, but not all of them have this Orange County chopper theme. And so we signed off on a development agreement with a proven partner with a proven track record with T-Rex. And T-Rex alone, in the profits it's made in terms of paying back into the Star Bonds, has more than covered this one. So Schuster on a whole, with the two project, has more than covered the loss in the Backfire Barbecue just with the T-Rex restaurant and its success. So Schuster alone has proven to be a good partner, and on the whole, we've made money and are continuing to make money from Schuster Properties and from Red. Red has proven to be a terrific partner, and we're making money off of the investment that Red has made. But we didn't sign off on how much a motorcycle costs. We signed off on a concept of Orange County choppers with a budget that was presented to us by the group and said, we think that $3 million investment for an attraction, not only for that restaurant, but for bringing people out, because the idea was, we got to get motorcyclers out to the Legend. So we put in motorcycle parking and everything, which is just white striping on a parking lot apparently. But we put in motorcycle parking to bring more people out, and it did pay back in its 3.5 years about $500,000 of sales tax into the property. It did not cover itself when that project went under. And we had the auction, which didn't cover enough of the loss. So we lost, if it's a $3 million project, it paid back $500,000, about $2.5 million loss, the unified government's portion of that. And we need to be good stewards with the state's money as well. But about 2/3 of that project, state money. And so the unified government alone probably lost $800,000, took in about $150 from the auction, and got about $50,000 worth of restaurant equipment that we can use in our buildings. So I'd say we lost about $600,000. All told, though, T-Rex Restaurant and that partner, both Red and T-Rex, have more than made that up. So I wish we hadn't lost money in this project, and I think we do need to be careful stewards of people's money, and I would say we have been. But I would say they didn't bring a line item budget to us and say, we're going to buy a motorcycle for this much, because if you look at these custom motorcycles, I would have said that's ridiculous for a motorcycle. We bought into a concept to draw people to the Legends, and the concept didn't work, and it lost money. And so we need to be conscious when we make investment deals in partners that we invest wisely, we invest in partners that are going to pay us back, and I would say both Red and Schuster have more than paid us back for that investment. I wish this particular one had made money. So I feel good about it. I think we should continue to be aggressive, continue to be innovative, and continue to press forward. And I think we need to also be careful, make sure we get our bang for the buck from our auctioneer, make sure we have the money verified by partners like Zimmer, and we need to be smart about how we invest our money, and we need to get the word out. I agree with Commissioner Kane. People in our community ought to know about this auction. It's our stuff. We ought to get the word out to our community better. And if there was a miss in that, maybe that was the third layer that was missing. You went out to the motorcycle dealers, but maybe it should have been a better local, since it was an auction on our stuff, there should have been a better local advertisement so our people could have had a shot at it. At least our people would have been interested in going to learn about it. And so I think that was a miss. But anyway, I think it's good to go back and look at the development deal as a whole. I think we have learned some things from this, and I think we need to continue.
Could you,
Walker and then
I'm
Walters.
only going to say, I don't know what the values were and how much we should have made. There was a time in my life where I went to a lot of auctions.
Can you speak directly into the microphone, please?
There was a time in my life when I went to a lot of auctions.
Thank you.
And I got to tell you, I never went to an auction to pay full price. So the idea that we were ever going to get full price for these items is not realistic. You go to an auction to get a deal. Did people get a deal, a better deal than they should have? Yeah, I really believe that we were underpaid. The only other option we had was try to individually sell these items on a one-by-one basis, and that would have fallen to administration. Those are your only two choices. And I assume that auction is, with the comments that have been made, which I agree with, probably the preferred way to dispose of excess property, as opposed to trying to sell it on eBay for an item at a time.
Commissioner Walters, and then Commissioner Murguia.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, absolutely, voting for the concept is one thing. Voting to spend, again, since I don't have the details, $50,000 on a motorcycle, there wasn't a vote for that. So there was no vote on that. And this meeting, I didn't think was any attempt to belittle Village West or belittle work that our staff have done. That wasn't, I didn't think, the intent at all. The intent is, as Commissioner Walters said, is to learn from our mistakes. Getting in the weeds is that when a deal like this goes badly, the public looks to their elected officials for answers. And we, as the elected officials, have to answer them. And if I don't know the answers to their questions, I have to ask. And when I find out answers that I'm concerned about, I think it's my responsibility to articulate that. And I think it's very important that that be done in a very transparent, open government process in front of the public. So all I'm trying to say is absolutely everything this government's going to do is not going to be a success. Overall, Village West has been an amazing success, and everybody up here has worked very hard on it, including our staff and our administrator. I'm just saying, if we're going to be the #1 tourist attraction in the state of Kansas, we should know how much tourist attraction items cost and what the potential resale value of them is, especially since we still own, I believe, aquariums and fish at Cabela's. Could be wrong, but I think we do. And we own other pieces of equipment like that. So that was the only point to my comments. I just don't want to see it happen again. Are there going to be additional tourist attraction type opportunities and economic development deals around those kinds of things? Absolutely.
All right. I don't see any other comments. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for coming. Mr. Bach, I want to thank you for putting the presentation together. We are now adjourned to our 7 o'clock. We need some transition time, both for our tech staff as well as the commissioners, so we will start downstairs at 7:20.
This is UGTV, your local government channel.